Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's program. My name is Rhonda Hoffman. I'm the genealogy specialist in the Grosvenor Room in the Central Library in downtown Buffalo. Today's program is Kindred Stories, a genealogy panel discussion. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to our speakers. Welcome, everybody, and welcome to our wonderful speakers today.
Good morning. I'm Sharon Amos, president of the Buffalo Genealogical Society of the African Diaspora, and we're excited to be presenting today from our publication, which is Kindred Stories. We have, we worked on this particular publication for several years, and we're excited to see its completion and the collection, which it is a collection of stories by our members, and it includes not only stories, but photos and a history of the Genealogical Society and its beginnings in 1996 and things that the Society has accomplished. And I must, credit our Buffalo Funeral Program as one of our ongoing programs in the Society. And we have 4 members of our group today who are going to be presenting on their stories that are included in the publication Kindred Stories. Our 4 members, and I'll just introduce them in the order that they can present, so I won't be back to introduce each one of them. Sharon Holly will be our first presenter. Bernice Prince will be our second presenter. Linda Capers-Wheeler will be our third presenter, and Brenda Brown, our final presenter. So we'll begin with Sharon Holly. Can't hear you.
Unmuted. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm really excited to be a part of the book, the Kindred Stories book. I am a member of the Genealogical Society, and even though I have been working on genealogy for at least 20 or more years, I still consider myself a beginner in terms of what I know and how to look for things that I need to know. So in the book, Kindred Stories, I decided that I would concentrate on my father. I would have to say, as an aside note, I had not done all the genealogical research on my dad, and I was wondering, I had a lot of questions, I should say this, because growing up, I was really not interested in a lot of things that he was talking about. And I'm sure a lot of people my age probably said, I wish I had paid attention. I wish I had listened more, but I didn't pay that much attention. In fact, my mother would say, I'm tired of hearing stories about World War II. Can you talk about something else? When he would sit us down and try to show us photos and show us his book and talk about it. And now I wish I had paid more attention. But at any rate, I want to say after my father passed away, and he passed away in Buffalo, New York, because he was up here ill at the time. When I went to clean out the house, he had a lot of those spiral notebooks in his dresser drawer. And instead of just dumping the drawer out, which you would have been inclined to do when you saw all the things that you had to clean up, I decided I would pick up one and look at it. And when I opened the book, it started to answer a lot of questions that I had before that I did not know. Because over the years, my father had gotten these spiral notebooks and would just write down random thoughts, things that happened to him when he was growing up, people in the neighborhood that he knew, things that were all about him. So I'm going to show you now one photograph of my dad, so you know who I'm talking about here. And this is my father, Johnny Willie Mathan Jordan. I never got to ask the question why he had two middle names, but in his life he really only used Johnny M. Jordan, who was born December the 30th, 1905, in High Springs, Florida, as he often recalled, out in the woods of High Springs. So I don't know if he was born in the city limits or outside the city limits. But he died October 3rd, 1993 in Buffalo, New York, but he is buried in High Springs. And so what I found out from going through his notebooks was something about his life, something about the community. And I'm just going to read a little portion of what I had written about him that was found in the notebook. And he would often title the things in his notebook, I remember it well. So he would kind of start off the notebook saying, I remember it well, and then he would go along and talk about it. So my dad was employed with the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, and I found out later, so was his father, was also employed by the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. So he kept these notebooks talking about his life, and there were different notebooks. There was a yellow notebook, there was a light blue notebook, there was a green notebook, and things were in his writing. And sometimes he would even scribble um, drawings to show what he was doing while he was working on the railroad. So he started out in one notebook by saying, I can remember my parents telling me, Joseph and Mary Jordan. They moved to Florida from Abbeville, South Carolina in the year 1904, out to suburbs of High Spring, Florida, at a place called Forest Grove, Florida. They farmed for a man named Mr. Mays. In 1905, I was born out there. We stayed there until 1908. Then we moved to High Springs. In 1909, we lived west of High Springs in a house belonging to a man named Mr. Bill and Eliza Dixon. The same year, we moved south of High Springs to a place called the Braddock's house. My dad worked, he said, in the mines or something close to south of Wades. So I was kind of unsure about some of the writings that he had. And he said, and this is where I began to find out some of the genealogy about my father, because he said, and he's talking about his father, he said, his oldest brother came to visit him from Atlanta, Georgia. His name was Jesse Jordan, and he had a son named Jesse Jr. Well, when I began to look in the census, the 1880 census listed Jessie Jordan as a daughter of Allen Jordan. So I was never sure whether the census report just took it from the name, saying that Jessie with the E, with an IE, might have been a girl's name and just listed it as a daughter, or if the census taker actually saw a person there and knew it to be a boy. But he said in 1911, we moved a little further south to a place called the Pear Orchard. Then he talks about his dad working on a farm there. And then he talked about coming back into the city. So he says, I remember how I would go out in the woods picking up wood for my mother to wash white people's clothes for 75 cents a bundle. That was big money back then. During these days, my dad was working for ACL, which was the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. My dad got a railroad pass for my mother and all of us children, and we went to, and this is where he started naming names where relatives probably used to live. Abbeville, South Carolina, McCormick, South Carolina, Greenwood, South Carolina, and Darlington, South Carolina. My dad had another brother in South Carolina. His name is George Jordan, and he had one son named George Jr. and another one named Steen. Now, Steen probably was a nickname. But at any rate, a lot of the information I got to start the genealogy, especially on my dad, came from things that he had written down over the years. So I guess it's up to me to try to verify some of the things that he wrote down, including I was able to find some of those names in census reports. I was able to find sometimes a letter from a person or address in an address book. However, by the time I began to try to search these people, they were long gone and they were no longer in the area, so that left like a lot of dead spots. What I also found about him was in his writings, I found a little bit about living in the town where he grew up and also where I grew up. He talked about the first time he saw an airplane, thinking that it was a hay boiler. I don't know how you could imagine an airplane being a hay baller, but he thought it was a hay baller in the sky, even though it was an airplane. But being they were in the country, they had never seen one before. So, that was like spectacular. He mentioned also about cars, and he talked a lot sometimes about a car, several cars that he had. He loved cars. So he talked about cars that he had turned over, cars that he said were haunted, uh, just different cars in the community. He also mentioned, things about him, about a baseball team in the town. My mother was his second marriage. His first wife had died, and he married my mother about a year later after his first wife had died. So he and my mom had one child, which was me, but my dad had another child before he had married my mother. And apparently that child is still living. I think he's in his late 90s. At the time that I speak. But he talked about the first wife, and he talked about how he met her, which he had these funny stories. So in about 1974, maybe, I had an idea when I went home to record him. I had my little cassette tape recorder, and we sit at the dining room table, and I just said, I'm going to ask you questions and you could talk about it. And I just pressed play and record and began to ask some questions. And this was when I began to get a lot more of the stories with the flavor that he told them, some very humorous that we talked about. It's also where he would tell me things about World War II, how it was for him in World War II. And he had also made a little list of every ship that he had been on in going to fight in World War II. And the fact that he came back home alive, that was his most important thing. My dad was a collector of things. I won't call him a hoarder because he was organized, unlike his daughter. But he kept things. I recall being very interested in the fact that he had the aluminum cup from World War II. And this was the cup that would collapse and you could put in your pocket when you carried it around. So as a child, I was very fascinated that he had an aluminum cup that I could pull up and make a cup and drink from it. And when I finished, I could smash it down flat and put it in my pocket. But these are the things that he had kept. He kept his list that he got when he first got in the Army, how many pair of socks, how many pair of trousers that he was issued. These are the things that he kept. Over the years, he was an amateur photographer, often taking pictures of people in the neighborhood and developing them using our bathroom for a dark room, which also didn't set too well with my mother because we only had one bathroom in the house and he was often in there with the door closed telling us we couldn't come in because we'd mess up his pictures as he was developing. So a lot of the history, the things that I got from things that he had written down, from things that he remembered. So I would just say in this is my contribution for the book. What I've learned is don't just throw everything out. And if you do get a chance to talk to your relatives, please take that opportunity to talk to them, because I find that the stories that they want to talk about is the things that really meant something important to them that they wanted you to remember. So the other picture I would show you is my dad's father, whose name was Joseph Jordan. And I don't have a picture of his wife, Mary Morton, who died very young. She died in 1927. So she was very young when she passed away. There's also a photograph that I will show of my parents, because 6 months after he married my mother, he got drafted into World War II. So these are just the things that I want to share, and I'm so excited to print my story in the Kindred Stories book. And I was also able to share that book with the public library from my hometown, in case there are people from the hometown who are looking for some genealogy stories or stories about people who grew up in High Springs, and maybe they will come up to my father's story and find a little information about how growing up in High Spring was in the 1900s. So I will either, let's see, let me stop sharing. So from this, I don't know if we're going to do questions right away, or I can wait till the end after other presentations have been done and answer questions then.
We'll wait until the end, till everyone has presented.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Our next presenter.
I was glad to have this opportunity to be a part of Kindred Stories. And I chose my mom because she migrated from Alabama to Lackawanna when she was 16. And I named the story A Diamond in the Rough. She came from Moundsville, Alabama. She had married at a young age to a guy in the service, and he was abusive. So she ran away from him. When she went back to her mom tried to send her back, but she refused to go. And she ended up with a lady by the name of Mary Wilson. And my father was in the Army. He came home from the Army and found my mother staying with his cousin, Mary. So that's how they united. My father left Alabama and came to Lackawanna looking for a job, but later sent for my mom and brought my mom to Lackawanna. They started a family. I was their firstborn. In the 1950 census, I was able to find my mom and me. My mom was 19, and I was with her in a rooming house. I was a year and 7 months. So everything lined up with the story that I had heard. Where my father was still remains to be seen. Maybe he wasn't there at the time. But in my story, I told how after they united, 2 years later, there was another girl born, my sister. and they would travel from Lackawanna to Alabama to see relatives. So we were in two different worlds. When we went to Alabama, we didn't know anything about houses up on bricks. We didn't know anything about an outhouse. So when we got there, my mother's sister lived in the city in Birmingham. So we would stay with her first, and her house looked like our house in Buffalo, in Lackawanna. She was in the city. There was the airport right behind her. We were dressed in our pretty clothes. She took us to church on Sunday. But when my father came back for us to take us to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to see his relatives, there were dirt roads, that red clay that so many people ate. The house was a 2-room house with a bench on the front porch held up by 2 chains. On the back was a tin tub where all of us children would bathe. If you had to go to the bathroom, when we said we need to use the bathroom, we were looking for a bathroom. And my mother led us out in the back and down away from the house to an outhouse. I don't know if you can see this, but I had a picture of an outhouse. My granddaughter visited me yesterday, and I was telling her about this presentation, and I mentioned the outhouse. She's 22 years old. She said, "Grandma, what is an outhouse? I never heard of that." And I had to explain to her. And she said, "An actual house?" I said, "Well, it was built like a house, but very small, just enough to encase what might have been reminiscent of a toilet. It was actually a hole cut with some wood over it and just a hole so that you could sit on it and relieve yourself." And me being as small as I was, my mother had to hold me up over the hole. And you know, she would be saying, "Go, go," because it would be hot in there. But my grandmother had hogs. So there were hogs in a pen. You hear people say in hog pen. And they would keep all of their scraps and make slop for the hogs. And so there was always somebody designated to go out and feed the hogs. So it was definitely an experience for us. We didn't, we just did not understand. When we played, we ran underneath the house and played and got filthy dirty. And in the evening, somebody filled water in that tin tub. And all of the kids took a turn getting in the tub to be bathed. So I enjoyed it. It was, like I said, 2 different worlds. But my mom, when she was an adult, she enjoyed so many different things. She went to cosmetology school. She learned to perm. In her time, they were doing the jerry curl, the French perm. They were styling wigs. And she also liked to go fishing. She was very good at that sport. And she caught fish. She could skin a catfish. She brought a turtle home one time from Canada. So very adventurous. She joined a gun club and had a hunting license. So she was definitely my diamond in the rough. She could do anything. She fostered, she did emergency foster care for so many children that came through her home. She even got attached to 2 children and went through adoption with those and adopted 2. So I can't really say enough about her. I'm glad that I had the opportunity to have her in my life. She passed away in 2009 from a stroke. She had a stroke, but so many people knew her. They always called her Granny. The people in the neighborhood, she was always trying to help people, always giving advice. And I still, when I think about her, she would say, let your yeses be yes and your no's be no. So she was really definite about a lot of things. So that was what I chose to write about her, because she really made an influence on me. I had 2 sisters besides myself and 1 brother, and we all loved her. She had grandchildren, great grandchildren. She could bake the peach cobblers, very well known for her peach cobbler, red velvet cake, and even something they called better than sex cake. She made that one too. So she was the person I chose, and I'm glad to have written that story.
Thank you, Bernice. You never mentioned her name. Tell us her name, your mother's name.
I'm sorry. Her name, Mary Lou Dunlap, was her maiden name, and her married name, Mary Lou Didway, and then she was married a second time to someone with the last name Ridgeway.
Okay, thank you. And our third presenter?
Just unmuting myself. Good afternoon. Are we still morning? Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here this morning. And I'm going to share the story that I submitted. And the name of that is What a Difference a Name Makes. My grandmother, Pinky Lee King, she died in 1951. So I never knew her, never met her. My mother was a teenager when, I'm sorry, she died in 1949. I'm sorry, died in 1949. My mother was like 18 or 19 when her mom died. And we grew up just hearing stories about her. My grandfather remarried very shortly after my grandmother died, extremely shortly after. And we grew up hearing, stories about my grandmother, and also a family story about the cause of her death. So I'm just going to take just a minute and just read what I wrote. Behind me is my storyboard that I had actually done before the story. And it was after I found out more information about my grandmother. But I'm going to just read what I found first. Okay. Pinky Lee Wilson King, my maternal grandmother, died in 1949 at the age of 50. My mother, Ada Bell, was 19 years old at the time of her mother's death, and neither I nor any of my 7 siblings were even a thought. At an early age, I was intrigued by the idea of a grandmother, as my paternal grandmother, Beretha Biddle Capers, also died at a young age. She was actually 31 when she died. I grew up hearing stories about my grandmother, Pinky. Most were stories about her untimely death or murder, if you will. If one were to believe the stories told by my mother and her sisters. The one story was that my grandfather's girlfriend, Lucille Crowell, and yes, I put the lady's whole name in the book, was almost half his age, gave Pinky a piece of bad pork that made her very sick and eventually caused her death. It is a fact that at the time of my grandmother's death, that Lucille had given birth to 2 sons whom my grandfather acknowledged as his own. It is also a fact that my grandfather married Lucille on February 12, 1950, a little over 3 months after Pinky was buried on October 16, 1949. I recall my mother sharing a memory of Lucille moving into their home with an arm baby and how that made her feel. I would feel sad when I thought about Pinky and sad for my mother, as it was difficult for my young mind to understand how a child could survive without a mother. It was June of 1996 during a family vacation to Phoenix City, Alabama, that I had a strong desire to see where my grandmother was buried, to try in some way to connect with her. My Aunt Virginia, known by family as Sugar Wee, told me that Pinky was buried in an unmarked grave, but they all knew where it was located because at the head of the grave was a small tree that never grew. We made the 45-minute drive from Phoenix City to Hatchachubby, a small country town in Russell County, where both my parents were born. My mother's family church home, Mount Sinai Baptist Church, was just at the outskirts of town at the end of a long, winding dirt road. I remember that day, clear skies with sunshine so bright that we had to shield our eyes. Our car, driven by my husband Thomas, pulled up behind my cousin Jasper's truck and parked on that soft white sand just before the church. The graveyard at the rear of the church could be seen from the road. My children, Thomas Jr., 11, and Adea, 7, jumped excitedly from the car and ran up to the church, up and down the stairs, and then onto the side of the building, laughing and seeming so free and welcomed. I can't recall my husband or cousin at this point, just the children in the distance, and me emerging from the car, slowly looking around and feeling so overwhelmed with love and belonging that I began to sob out loud, hugging my body as I walked towards to the back of the church. It's difficult to put into words how light I felt walking amongst those tombstones, identifying so many family members while searching for my grandmother. When I saw the small tree at the head of the unmarked grave, I walked over to it and noted that it was positioned next to my grandfather's grave, which was marked with his full name, birth date, and death date, as well as a sentiment. That very day marked the beginning of my quest to find out all that I could about my grandmother and the promise to myself that her final resting place would not be left to be identified only by a small tree that never grew. What I knew about Pinky and was able to confirm on sites like Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, and from interviews with my aunts and other family members was that she was born in Alabama. Her maiden name was Wilson, and she married my grandfather, Joseph King, in 1914, had 12 children and 2 or 3 siblings. I also knew the story about her death. I didn't know much of anything that could be verified about my grandmother's life before her marriage to Joseph, including information on her parents and siblings. Once I located the marriage license for my grandparents, I was quite confident that Pinky's maiden name was indeed Wilson. And other than the U.S. federal census reports from 1920 and 1930, my search for Pinky's story hit a brick wall. In March of 2008, my son Thomas Jr. planned a visit to Alabama. So knowing that Pinky died in Columbus, Georgia, which is just across the bridge, I asked my son to stop by the County Department of Vital Statistics to request a copy of her death certificate, hoping that it might provide her parents' names. That document provided the first clue to the fact that Wilson might not be Pinky's maiden name. My grandfather, who was listed as the informant on the death certificate, identified Pinky's mother as Laura Wixon. I noted the difference and was determined to find out more. Later that same year, while in Alabama for the Thanksgiving holiday, I had the opportunity to visit the Russell County Courthouse, which is in Phoenix City, to search for property deeds and vital records for family members. During the search, I came across the marriage license for my uncle Harvey Lee King. On the form, my uncle identified his mother as Pinky L. Wilkerson. With this new piece of information in hand, I called my mother's youngest and last living sibling, Ruby King Jakes, who lived in the Atlanta, Georgia area. When I asked her about the name Wilkerson, she stated, "That's my mama's people," to which I responded, "Well, I thought her family name was Wilson." Aunt Ruby, in her sassiest voice, said, "Wilson, Wilkerson, it's all the same thing, baby." I could not help but laugh. I could barely wait to get home to log on to www.ancestry.com so that I could see what I would find when I put in the corrected maiden name for my grandmother Pinky. The 1900 and 1910 census reports provided information that I'd never heard of. Just those two documents took me back in time with Pinky to age 4 and age 14. The names of both her parents, all of her siblings, and even the name of a nephew were revealed. On Sunday, July 19th, 2009, a headstone was dedicated and blessed for Pinky Lee Wilkerson King. The majority of my first cousins joined together, along with my siblings, to contribute the funds to purchase the headstone pictured in the book, which was placed in the 60th year of her death. The descendants of Pinky Lee Wilkerson King, who were in attendance at Mount Sinai Church for the final day of the first United King family reunion, were led by my Aunt Ruby, who was wearing a purple hat, as each of us placed a pink rose in the vase at the base of the headstone during the gravesite dedication and blessing. Pinky Lee Wilkerson King, my forever loved grandmother, no longer resting in an unmarked grave. So that was how I discovered the last name of my grandmother. And the story behind the story is that we just have to keep looking. Of course, I knew that my grandmother had to have a life before she married my grandfather, because that's all the information I could find. So by just continuing to ask and to take notes and to pay attention, like on that death certificate, that my grandfather had given them Wixon, and I was like, Wixon, what's that about, And then later someone had sent me something and it had like Wilkes on it. So it all came together. And as I told my Aunt Ruby, Wilson and Wilkerson are not the same thing. But we do have to keep looking and we do have to keep searching to find our ancestors. My quest now is to locate Beretha Capers, because to my I don't even know where she's buried. The cemetery that I was told that she was buried at was taken over by another church. So I have no idea, but that is my quest before I leave this earth, is to find her and to hopefully one day find a photograph of her, because I've never seen her face. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Linda. And yes, and as I said, we'll save questions for the end. Brenda, are you ready?
I'm here.
Okay, Brenda Brown, our next and our last presenter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Brenda Salter Brown, and yes, Aaron Salter was my cousin. I wrote on my grandfather, who was called Tweet Salter. He was called Tweet Salter. He was born in 1890. He was born in 1895 down in Crenshaw County, Laverne, Alabama. However, during his time, when I got to know my grandfather, I remember I used to always watch him. He would walk. I always remember him wearing steel tip belts, and he always threatened to whoop us with those belts. But he liked his mints, especially those soft mints. He always, and then he also liked his snuff. He would always do that and have his little can of snuff. However, he walked really bad. And one day I asked the question to my mom. I asked him, I said, why does granddad walked like that. We call him granddad. And this, she told me, she said, well, they broke his back when he was in jail. However, they never shared the story about that. I would hear bits and pieces about it, but no one never really shared the story about it until my grandmother, who was his wife, Ruby. She told me that he had went to jail, and she said it was a family that they were accused of killing down in that area. So I chose him because I wanted to learn more about him and learn more about the Salter side of my family, because I knew I had all my relatives, but I didn't know much about them. But in doing the research, I found so many articles and so many different things about what had happened during the time in the South. During the time in the South, it was a lot of stories told, and it was a lot of different things of a township and different things like that. However, from what I gathered in my research was that my grandfather's father was a moonshine person. He did the moonshine, because he did moonshine, and back in the woods around where they were, they found the stills and different things. But however, he was considered to be more financially stable than a lot of the African Americans around there, and they attribute it to being because he had a number of sons that could go out and sell different things, and that. So my story actually starts off describing my grandfather. His name was John Tweet Salter, and that was my father's father. Now, just a little blurb about, before I get into my story, just a little blurb about Aaron Salter. Aaron Salter, the police officer, he is under the same tree and the same line that I'm in. His grandfather was my grandfather's brother. And that's how he is in our family. And that he is also Carol Salter Glover's, that's her son. Carol Salter Glover, that's Aaron's mother, who was the general manager of Buffalo. That was his mother. But he falls under the same line of the same son that their father was named Benjamin Salter, and he had a number of sons and a couple of daughters. So, like I said, I started my research looking at him. My grandfather Tweet. I noticed that in the early 30s that he worked in the coal mines, the Montevallo coal mines, and that he worked on the same coal mine company that my mom's father worked on, and that's where my parents married. However, the story of him starts back in the 1910s. What he was a roadie worker, and he worked under a Jack Shirley, and he would do odd jobs, and they had an overseer that did things. However, there was a conflict there because he felt that Jack Shirley did not like him and tended to put a lot of things on their family. And in fact, the whole family felt that way. And there was a time that he got into a conflict with Jack Shirley and he left. Now, I also, in my research, I found out that at the age of 13, that he was in jail for a bit. So I kind of figured that must have been what happened. I'm not really sure because very little is said about it, but I'm not really sure about that. And he was gone for a few months. When he came back, he happened to see the overseer of Jack Shirley, and he told him, he said, "Tell Jack Shirley that I have something to settle with him." Later on that night, Jack Shirley and his father were walking up, had to go past the Salter house to their house when some gunshots came out. In which him and his father was hit. Then at that same time, gunshots were then exchanged between some of the friends and also of Jack Shirley's family and then of the Salters. They prevented the doctors from going up and helping them. The Salters, and then even some of the whites in the white neighbors and things were also telling other white families, don't go up in that area because of the shooting and everything. They went on, my grandfather and his brothers, it was him and a couple of brothers, they went on the run and they ran into the field, and it was a manhunt. The papers, I looked at all the papers and I read there was a manhunt for a few days, and the sheriff thought that he knew that they had family around the way. And it's even, I'm hearing now, even as I was talking to you before this was written, that the Masons may have also been instrumental in keeping some of them safe. But however, they couldn't find him for a time. So what they decided to do, a posse of white men decided to go to my grandfather, try to get from him where he was. And when they didn't tell the story, they had prepared to lynch him. And what saved him was that the sheriff got a posse together hearing this and got there just in time before they actually hung him. However, they did knock him down, and he had told them that he had about $100 and something in a trunk in his house. I don't know if they ended up getting the money out. However, after the sheriff had stopped the lynching and took him to and was taking him to the jail for safety, they burnt his house down. They burned his house down. It was maybe a couple of days after searching for him, a few days later, they were able to find him in the swamp area down there, and they was able to capture him and send him to jail. They sent him to what was called, he was sentenced for 20 years, and he was sentenced at the prison at Flat Top Mines. Now, when I was first reading his arrest record, I never realized that where he was written right on there, because it was written in pencil. It wasn't until after I did the story that I found out that it was the prison at Flat Top Mines. So what I did was I went online and I found the prison. The prison was actually located on the mining area, and that's the mining area that he worked. At that mining area, there was an explosion. There was an explosion in which my grandfather was injured very seriously. He was refused he didn't get the medical attention that he needed. And that's what gave him that deformity, the deformity of walking. However, even though he was deformed in that manner, he was still later on in life able to work at another mine, like I said, the Montevallo mining camp. And he was still able to father. He got married and he fathered 9 children with my grandmother. And he married Ruby. He married my grandmother, who was Ruby Anderson, who also lived in that area. He lived, while he was in the prison, they released him early because they didn't think he was going to live beyond the injuries that he did. However, he did live to be 62 years old. He fathered 9 children. He lived up here, and he's buried out at the Mount Hope Cemetery. I chose that story, as I said before, because I didn't know much about my grandfather. Much of the Salter history was not told. Our parents didn't think to tell it because they liked to keep those things secret. And a lot of times my dad said, "Oh, you don't need to know this and that." But like I said, my grandmother shared with me some of the story, and then my mom did. And I didn't really pay too much attention until I got into the history of writing down my family tree. And I happened to read this article that says any Negro they were looking for any Negro, and that's the story that led me to the reading about my great-grandfathers almost being lynched. The one thing that I got from this whole process and is that I always tell people, if things are written in the newspaper, and there was a lot of newspaper articles, they're no longer secrets, and they're best that you share them so that we can get the actual story from the people that are actually living, and we can get and hear it from their actual voices. What I do now is whenever I talk to some of my older aunts and uncles that are still living, their cousins, I run my phone just so that I can record the stories, and also their voices will always be remembered because you will always hear it in their voices. The other thing that I would like to also say, my goal is to Jack Shirley, even though he was shot and he was considered murdered, there's a newspaper article that says that he wasn't killed at the time as originally reported. I've looked and I've searched for a death certificate. I haven't found one. I do know that he still has descendants that live in Crenshaw County, Alabama. My goal is to talk to them and actually find out, when did he die? Was he dead at the time that my grandfather was actually sentenced, or I knew he eventually died from whatever he had, but when did he die? And did he die at the time of the arrest, or at the time when my grandfather went into prison? So that's the goal of that. And the other thing is, like Linda said, my goal is also to, on both sides of my family, both the Craig and the Slaughter side, is to possibly meet a descendant from each one of their siblings, just to get to know that, because there are some siblings that I still don't know of my grandfather's brothers, and like my either side, and even of my grandmothers, because I know it's a lot of family out there. We all share the same name, and somehow we're going to find out exactly how we fit in the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. It took me to do that. It took me about a couple of years, because really I had started looking up my history back in the 80s, and in the late 80s, after talking to one of my coworkers who was looking up, I went out to the Mormon church, and that's when we had to get the census and try to read the fiche and stuff like that. But it wasn't until, and I couldn't find anything that I really could find on there about any of the members, because I didn't know, I was seeing these names, but I had never heard of these things before, until the computers actually became a lot more sophisticated and a lot more up to date. And then I was able to find things, and a lot of times I was able to see things, notice that a lot of the names were not spelled in the way in which I knew, but however, I knew that was my family. So that's my story. That's the story that I have put in, and I have my family has bought it, and we have a Martin and Salter reunion coming up, in which I will be reading and telling them more about the history. And now I think also that history now will also include my cousin, Aaron.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank our 4 presenters today, Sharon Holly, excuse me, Bernice Prince, Linda Capers Wheeler, and Brenda Brown. And I'd also like to thank Sandra Williams Bush for coordinating with Rhonda to provide us this venue for our stories, and from our book, Kindred Stories. And I would just like to say that in addition to the stories that were shared today, you know, it's necessary for me to say that we mourn the lives of the 10 members of our community and other family losses that have happened during this week also. And we share these stories, but there are stories that will not be told because of the loss of life in our community.